Hey, welcome to the Jungle Brothers podcast. It's Joey here. You might have caught last week's episode where Paulie and I had a chat about gender violence, and this has been something really big in the media here in Australia of late. A conversation that neither of us were particularly or are particularly well prepared to have. All that said, we felt it was an important conversation for us to have. This week, we were extremely lucky to be able to have Professor Michael Salter join us on the podcast. Michael Salter is an expert in child sexual exploitation and in gendered violence. He works with the University of at the University of New South Wales, and he's the director of Childlight in their School of Social Sciences. Now, he's been advising the government for over 10 years on policy in regards to gendered violence, amongst many other things. But gendered violence, and specifically male violence perpetrated against women, is what we wanted to speak about today. I think we did a really good job of exploring the conversation and in a way that allowed Paul and I to grasp some of the complexity of a topic such as this. I really hope you enjoy the episode. It was a real honour to have Dr. Michael Salter join us. Now, if you need to speak with anyone, if you've had violence perpetrated against you, you can reach the National Family Violence Counselling Service on 1-800-737-732. Let's get into the chat. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Michael Salter, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
Mate, let me start with the story on how I know you from the gym. Okay? Because I don't coach here anymore. I train in the gym and I'm usually off to the side doing my thing. And I see this guy that goes hard. Mm-hmm. And we touched on this a moment ago. I can see this guy that's like sometimes I can see an element of distraction maybe, right? Especially when the coach is talking a bunch and I can see you're like
swinging on the bars.
Yeah, like I'm just going to work on this while you fucking talk a bunch.
Yeah.
Right? But you see, right? People stand out, like a hard worker, high achiever in the gym. And then I catch wind of this criminologist in the media who specializes in a whole bunch of pretty horrible stuff, domestic violence, child sex offenders, and the like. And I can't remember how I put it. I put it together because in the gym social group, there was a discussion on a paper you had written.
Yes.
And I'm like, Michael Salter, that's the guy. Yeah. And that then explains the training approach and all of that. I'm like, okay, I get this. Can you tell us, just the synopsis of what you do?
Yeah. So I'm a criminologist. I'm a professor. I'm the director of Childlight at UNSW. So we're a research centre that focuses on child sexual abuse and exploitation, both online and offline. But part of that as well, when you do a lot of work with adult survivors who've got, pretty bad childhoods, then particularly for a lot of the women I do work with, they've often got histories in adulthood of domestic violence. And it's been pretty common that for some of the men that I'm speaking to, that they've been accused of domestic violence. And so as a result, I sort of do work like across the lifespan around violence and abuse. These are sort of topics that are hard to keep discreet. Once you start looking at something like child abuse, you end up opening up to family violence, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, okay. I suppose the impetus to speak with you on the show was really about the current coverage of violence against women, and specifically women being killed by men here in Australia. I guess we can't have a conversation where we're not going to also touch on child sex abuse, right? To have you here on the show, but at least in my mind, I'm like that was kind of the thing that I wanted to try to understand better.
Yeah.
Paul and I had a chat on the show last episode where it was almost an introduction to having this conversation with you, where we were trying to unpack a bit of it ourselves. And I don't think it came across particularly well because it's a hard topic to talk about.
Yeah.
But I think we felt that was important because, guys have a role to play in this, obviously. And so guys should be able to sit and have a conversation about it. But it's kind of the thing that you don't talk about much.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what struck me what I felt when I read a reference to your work in the news, and I'd like you to talk on that. So we had a lot of protests. There was a tipping point, I suppose, about 3 weeks ago. Regarding men killing women. And at that point, this thing came about where, big protests, a lot of media coverage, and the sentiment was men need to do better, right? And I totally agree with that, right? It's a great sentiment. But as a father, as a man, and then also as a father of 2 kids, it left me thinking, what are the practical measures I can take for that, right? And we were talking about it, sure, we can do your best to raise your kids in a way that you think is going to prepare them to be not perpetrators of this violence, but that doesn't play out for another 20 years. So you're like, fuck, what can I do now? And then I saw a reference, I think it was in the Sydney Morning Herald, to your work, and it was you were sort of refuting this thing of saying men need to do better and saying, no, we need to actually focus on measurable outcomes. Pornography, alcoholism, gambling. Can you talk on that?
Yeah. So, Australia really sort of leads the world in investing in the prevention of violence against women, and just recognizing no country in the history of the world has figured this out. And so in that respect, it's really exciting to have Australia really kind of leading the way. We've had 10 years where the focus has been on basically trying to improve attitudes, and particularly trying to improve men's attitudes towards women. And the argument has been that that's the primary driver of violence against women. For me, because I work in trauma and I work around child maltreatment, it's always been clear to me that it's much more complex than that, that we have this disproportionate role of child maltreatment for boys. And that's true across all criminal offending, is that for boys where they experience adversity or trauma in childhood, there's all of these negative outcomes for boys that we don't see so much for girls. The outcomes are different for girls. But one of the negative outcomes for boys is violence, including domestic violence, but others as well. And it's not for everyone. It's just that it increases the risk. So about 10 years ago, I was involved in the establishment of what's now called Our Watch, which is the National Prevention Agency, and I provided a brief of evidence around some of the risk factors. And I was really struck by the fact that they selectively took up some risk factors but not others. And in particular, what was intentionally excluded from the conversation was firstly alcohol and the role of alcohol in violence against women, but sort of broader questions around the online environment, broader questions around poverty and socioeconomic status. And so, we've had 10 years, we've spent over $100 million. It hasn't moved the dial at all. And I think one of the things we've learned the last 10 years is attitudes is actually pretty hard to change. So you can have a lot of advertising campaigns, you can have programs at school. It hasn't really changed men's attitudes. We're sort of at a pivot point now where we've got a new Commonwealth government, a Labor government. We're a bit more constrained under what we could say under the Liberals and the Conservatives, but there is an opportunity to do things differently. And the fact is that if the prerogative is to keep women and children safe, and we've had 10 years and our approach hasn't worked, well, there's actually a whole bunch of other things that we can do and that we know will drop violence. And alcohol is one of them, because anytime the government needs to reduce violence overnight, they regulate alcohol. And they've done that in Alice Springs multiple times. They've done it in Newcastle, and violence drops just like that.
Wow. Just on that, and there's a lot of things to dig into, right, with almost everything you say. You said attitudes are hard to change. Why? Tell me more about that.
I mean, I'm not sure I even believe in the existence of attitudes, if you know what I mean. An attitude is just someone's orientation to the world, how they understand themselves, how they understand other people. That's really complicated. And it builds up over the course of someone's life. And the idea that you can just come in and change someone's view of how the world works through an advertising campaign or a slogan or telling men to be better, and particularly for the adults I work with that have had really awful childhoods, their view of the world is really fixed and set by these bad things that have happened to them, and they're not going to change that just because someone tells them that it's the wrong thing to believe. So I think there's just been a kind of a naivety out there, and we need to learn our lessons. Violence against women hasn't reduced. Intimate partner violence has increased over the last couple of years. We need to do something about it. But yeah, in the last 10 years at the same time, certain people have built their careers around delivering this work. And so they're quite resistant because, frankly, this is how they get their mortgages paid.
You're talking about the attitudes. Like I just, when I hear that, it doesn't ring true to me. It's like, it's something that you can't really grab. And like you're talking about measurable outcomes. We actually want to work on something that we can measure to see whether it's effective or not. And how do you measure an attitude? It's kind of like having someone who doesn't train at all, and just to bring it down to the gym analogy, someone has had all of the variables of their life that's brought them to be, in the body that they're in, and probably that's pretty unfit, and they have no awareness of, nutrition and even just physicality, and it's just not, and you walking up to them on the street and saying, hey, you should actually see your life should be better and you just need to change your attitude, start training type of thing. But I guess going to what you suggest, the effective change might be with the measurable outcomes. And I'm just imagining in my head, and I'm using the gym analogy a bit. It's a bit like you have to have the structural changes, like making the hard decision easy type of thing. So take away alcohol. Yeah. That guy can't access alcohol. Yeah. And that's something that we can do. Yeah. And there's study to say that that's actually going to help. Yeah. If we don't have bad food in the fridge, you can't eat it type of thing. Is that kind of what you're talking about when it comes to solutions? It's
a great analogy, yeah. Like if you think about the gym, you think about people's relationship to their body, their relationship to food, their relationship to time, what they believe they're capable of, all of those things. Like it's a lot of work to change that, and there's a lot of different ways to change that. But ultimately, for someone to do that of their own free will, it's a huge amount of willpower to kind of change who you are. Whereas, making it cheaper, making it easier, living close to the gym, prepackaged healthy meals, like all of these things start to make those choices easier or harder depending on where you want to go. And where we've ended up with violence against women, which I think is really unfortunate, is there's this huge pressure basically on teenage boys. So a lot of the violence prevention measures are being delivered in schools. It's about 12, 13, 14-year-old boys. They need to change their attitudes. They need to do better. It's like, this kid's a kid. It's not his job to revolutionize society and bring about gender equality. And, in my work, I'm really clear about this. And I often have to talk to people about this quite a lot, which is we're the adults. We're literally the adults in the room, and we have a responsibility to kids. And you can't turn around to a 13-year-old, like a teenage boy, and be like, it's your fault for watching too much pornography and being a sexist pig and you need to change. It's like, if that kid's got problems in his life, it's actually our fault, and we need to take responsibility for that.
He's literally just started puberty and his testosterone's flying through the fucking roof. And he started high school. And, to say that, we have to be considerate of what they're going through. We need to find a solution, and that might not be it. We're going to be open to looking at other places, I guess.
Do you think there's a, because I'm guessing people have a resistance, say with the alcohol thing, I'm guessing some people have a philosophical resistance to, we need to manipulate certain inputs from the environment in order to get the behavior that we want. Because in that way, you're almost acknowledging that some things are kind of inherent in the system or inherent in the individual. And so in order to try to affect that thing that's inherently in there, we need to control the inputs. Versus saying change the attitude is well, let's just teach that person to be a better person.
Yes.
And that's I don't know, it kind of feels a bit holy because it's well, they're a bad person and now we're teaching this and we're making them good. Yeah. Do you get what I'm pointing out there?
100%. So unfortunately, the program of preventing violence against women has become one of basically moral uplift. So the idea is that sort of men and boys hold these bad attitudes and we're going to make them better people, and that's going to prevent violence. Now, if that worked, then fine, but it doesn't it doesn't work. And it ends up being quite prescriptive. So, you're only allowed to hold certain attitudes, and if you don't hold the right attitudes, then you're a bad person. And I mean, that's fine on a personal level. We make personal judgments of people all the time, but it's really none of my goddamn business what somebody thinks behind their eyes, within reason. It's just none of my business. I'm in the business of stopping violence. The government does control how much alcohol there is available to the community. The government does control, the type of content that's in the media. They already control it. And when they make really small measurable changes to things like alcohol availability. So in 2016, the New South Wales government allowed liquor shops to be open an extra hour. And over a 3-year period, that measurably increased the rates of domestic violence in the state. So,
Wow.
On one hand, we're saying, men have this responsibility to change and make decisions to keep women safe, but how is it not the responsibility of the policymaker or the alcohol lobby guy who's making $1 million a year selling alcohol policy? I think it's his responsibility.
And, to have, say, alcohol and gambling and pornography kind of sitting there on the shelf, desirable, and, I guess our, somewhere in our brain, like that's something that's appealing to us on a primal level, and say you have to be holy and not touch it is like one thing, but then they actually are out there in the market influencing us to our vulnerabilities as well. So they're there trying to make drinking casual and more around social things. Like they've got a lab of people being paid a lot of dollars for marketing to try and get us to do more. I mean, gambling's really fucked. I find that one just so, it's all bad, but like the techniques that they use to keep people betting and stuff like that is just, it's insane. Yeah, it just makes no sense. And I think when I saw you were on Channel 10 or something like that, you were talking about how like basically there's a lot of resistance because they're big industries, right?
Big money spinners.
Yeah.
They're big and powerful, and they very actively promote this language about personal responsibility. Like it's your job to make these decisions for yourself. But actually they are making decisions for us, and they're spending billions of dollars influencing the decisions that we make. And all that I'm asking is that the government steps in and the government acts in our interests, because, the private sector acts in their interests. They act in the interest of their shareholders and their bottom line. And we elect our governments to act in the public interest. And so that's all that I'm asking for. And it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve violence against women, but it will reduce it without question. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of just reducing rates of violence. And at a certain point, we will get to a nub of offenders who are complicated, who are really difficult to reach, but we haven't got there yet. And reasonably, if we implement these measures, so alcohol regulation, if we look at things like gambling, and the other area where we're doing some work is with Movember, sort of the men's health organisation, and just thinking about like what's the role of the men's health sector, because guys are walking in to talk about anxiety or depression or alcohol or gambling or addiction or whatever, but then they're starting to talk about their violence. And so that seems to me like a really good opportunity, like a way to get to bring men in from the cold and put them in an environment where maybe they can talk about things that they're a bit ashamed of. But if they're walking in to talk initially about mental health or alcohol or whatever, and then they're talking about their violence, and we can think about, well, frankly, maybe if we support you around your mental health, or we support you around your alcohol, or the fact that you're unemployed at the moment, is this going to reduce your risk of violence? And the answers for most of them is yes.
Does it's a global thing. You mentioned that earlier. Are there places that are countries that are doing a better job of managing this right now?
I think we see sort of like pockets of like interesting practice. So I remember years ago, Sweden being Sweden, it's a very liberal, very progressive, especially around criminal justice issues. So they had this program where they were releasing men who'd committed domestic violence from prison, which is a key kind of risk period where they go back and frankly stalk and attack their ex-partner. And so they were putting ankle bracelets on these guys, and they were doing an evaluation to look and see if the ankle bracelets prevented them from reoffending. But because it was Sweden, they could, as they left prison, they got like all this wraparound care. So they were supported into housing, they were supported into employment. If they had health issues, they were supported to access health issues. If they had issues around their educational attainment, they were supported into training. And so they're trying to evaluate whether this ankle bracelet works. But of course, at the same time, they're delivering all this wraparound support. And like right across the spectrum of offender, so low risk offender, medium risk offender, high risk offender, their reoffending dropped, like right across the board, because, surprise, surprise, these guys were miserable pieces of work who had shitty lives, and that was part of their violence. And frankly, if you made their lives less shitty, then they were less violent. And so it didn't prove that ankle bracelets worked, but what it did prove was that actually giving these guys post-release support, it is effective, and it keeps their partners and their kids safe. So to be honest, these are the sorts of insights that unfortunately have been kind of disallowed under a policy approach that's been really focused on gender equality. And when we try and talk to people in the sector to talk about men's health, what we often get told, at least until recently, is we're making excuses for men and we're making excuses for their violence. And my response back is, I don't care about making excuses for these men. I really don't. I'm not interested in making excuses for them. I would like to see them stop their violence, basically. Right.
It's the outcome that you're focused on.
I couldn't care. I honestly don't care about their moral uplift. I really am sorry. They don't have a lot of my sympathy. I work mostly with victims and survivors. My interest in offenders is, how did they become offenders? How do we stop them becoming offenders? And once they are offenders, how do we stop them offending?
But in doing so, you have to go in and try and understand the offenders, right?
Yeah.
So on that, I guess I wanted to ask, how do you know like where men are at as a population right now, say in Australia or globally, in terms of, and I feel like I know where men are going, just intuitively I walk around, I see a lot of people watch the news and stuff, but do you know some statistics in terms of, we know that suicide rates are sky high with men, even though women tend to attempt more, I think.
Yep.
But then like employment rates and stuff like that, all of those kind of, the social determinants there. Do you know some information about that can explain the situation of kind of men in general right now?
So, I mean, I think, in the Australian context, in terms of really positive intergenerational change, like, every generation of men, frankly, as we get away from kind of World War II and just this period where, we forget we had 50 or 100 years of, not only, colonisation and invasion and what white Australia did to black Australia, but we also had every generation of man for 2 or 3 generations was deployed in war and was coming back from war. The 20th century was a really, really violent century. And that's part of the inheritance that we live with as men, is a lot of our codes around masculinity are really militarised. And it's actually really about deployment to war. And even if we look at like the education system and the way boys were educated formally for a long time, that was about preparation for military service. Like the popularity of team sport, people don't realise, but this was institutionalised in the late 19th century because there was concern that boys were getting too weak to defend the empire. So like at boarding school and things like that, the point of team sports is you have teams, you have a captain, you go on drills. So this was all about militarising teenage boys in preparation for the defence of the English Empire. So that's a big sort of part of our inheritance that we sort of take for granted. And the further away that we get from kind of the mid to late 20th century, the better we are as men in terms of just our ability to be human beings instead of little military robots that the state, wanted us to be for a really long time. The issue for us, I think, is, the level of precarity. So the cost of living is so high. The fact is that, my parents had 3 kids and, a decent house at 24. Who can afford that?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, people are hitting those milestones in their late 30s, basically. And even then, the dream of home ownership.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think for men, that's really difficult. In terms of, for us, it's really hard for us to kind of measure like what counts as success. And I would say, like in my own career, it's only in my early to mid 40s that I feel like what I've got in my career and in terms of money in the bank, it won't just all fall apart like a house of cards. But in my 20s and 30s, that was very possible that I could lose my job, or like, you know, I wasn't earning enough money to buy a house. It was all of those things. It's only in my 40s where I'm like, oh, actually, like I feel comfortable.
I got something to show for my life.
Yeah, but that's 25 years of being on a hamster wheel.
And then you got all the problems, I think, with the people who have low socioeconomic status as well. So we're considered the lucky ones, but a lot of those other people have those other pressures that they never get out of that, right? And it's just generational.
And then like those jobs, you know, a lot of those jobs that are available to people on low incomes, like they're really unfulfilling. There's no career progression. You know, often it's casual. And, you know, I think men more than women are looking for those benchmarks that say of like success or social status or kind of honour. That seems like less acute for women for a range of reasons. And so you often end up with men who, you know, all of a sudden maybe Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson or whomever, it becomes much more appealing because he's presenting back at least some vision of like an honourable masculinity, where you can benchmark your own success against what matters to you. But I think for a lot of men, that's where they're really stuck, is they don't know what their moral system is. They don't know what should be important to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you, you know, you mentioned that the last century was really violent and it was a lot about preparing soldiers. Can you look back at a time in history, either of, you know, our culture or different cultures, where there was an absence of greater conflict, pretty much always, like wars, and where an image of masculinity could be formed without this, you need to take up arms and go defend the country?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because one of the things that happened in the 20th century as well was, you know, with kind of the rise of like science, you know, we get these really scientific ideas about like gender and sexuality and, you know, evolutionary psychology. And in a funny way, we've ended up kind of with these really fixed ideas of like even a notion of masculinity is like a funny thing to kind of have. When you look at, you know, I'm gay. And so one of the things that happens in the 20th century is that you have a notion of homosexuality and a notion of heterosexuality. Now, if you look at discrimination against gay men, there was much less of it in the 19th century. If you even look at prosecutions for sodomy, it was primarily for rape and child sexual abuse. Men weren't being prosecuted for consensual sex. Like in the 19th century, it was just like, oh, whatever, just do whatever you want. We don't really care. Just don't do it in public, and you know, and do it with consent. It was only in the 50s and 60s that you started to get prosecutions for consensual sexual activity between men, because you had a science of sexuality. Right? You had a science that said, well, this is the right way to do it and this is the wrong way. And now there's a type of person. And if you do this, you're a type of person and it means this about you, blah, blah, blah. So in a funny way, we've kind of ended up in a much more kind of gender polarized world. Whereas in the past, just there was less, people thought about it less, and maybe that was healthier.
Less labels.
Yeah, just more relaxed about the situation. Whereas, you know, now it's like, if I do this, it means this, and then I'm this, and it has these implications. Yeah.
Going back to what you're saying, Joe, just with that question, but also the militarization thing about the guys, don't we think that boys need a bit of that? As in, boys tend to have a need to fulfill, you know, some sort of maleness. They've got a lot of testosterone. I guess from an anthropological point of view, we're bigger, we're hunters and that sort of thing. Because I say that, like, because if we agree on that, I think the problem is that it's too, there's more facets to what a male should be. And I'm just trying to say that I think that there is that, and that we can't get rid of that, that physical masculinity, that aggression that we have.
Yeah.
But there's also like, it's got to be attached to other values, because there's actually other things that we should be doing in society in terms of caring, protecting, and, you know, holding down sort of other values. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. So I went to a friend of mine, their kid's bar mitzvah a couple of months ago, and it was just like, it was really striking because Zach's like, just 12, 13, so sort of coming of age. He'd had a year of like working with the rabbi to learn Hebrew. He had to memorize this particular like section of the Torah. He had to like stand up in front of everyone and like give this like teaching on what he learned from the Torah and like connect it to his life. And part of it, and went for like 2 hours, it was really interesting to watch, and it was at like quite a progressive synagogue, was also this commitment from the community and his family to him, but also vice versa. And this idea that like his family and community had this investment in his coming of age as a man, but also that meant he had all these responsibilities back. Mm-hmm. And we weren't the only people that were really struck by, in a way, like the architecture that put around him, and that put around him for the next 5 years of his life, when he is, entering into puberty and all sorts of stuff, as lots of changes to his body are going to be happening. But that we never had anything like that. Most young men never have that sense of, like, we're here for you through this time, and we're interested in your moral journey through this period, but vice versa, we have these expectations of you.
Yeah. And there's a challenge, like there's an inherent challenge there, isn't there? Which is, I keep going, thinking of that thing like combat or like war. It's like a challenge, something that's difficult that you have to go through. It's a transformative experience. Yeah. Rites of passage in a sense, right?
So like when the DV thing kind of came to prevalence down, we were talking about it. Like the first thing for me was looking to, guys as the problem. And I immediately go back to kind of the family structures, and I think that the family structures are broken down these days. I guess it's cool that we're seeing them differently, and there's many different ways of living, but I feel like there's parts of a family where, regardless of whatever gender and stuff, that we've lost, which is what you're kind of describing there. And I think that's part of a big problem. But without going into that, because I know we're veering away a little bit from, you're talking about like what policy can we change, because you want outcomes, right?
Yep.
So you've got clear outcomes in the kind of short term would be, we'll change these policies around this. But I wonder, like, in your recommendations and strategy for change, is there space for looking for other longer term investment types of strategies in terms of, hey, that actually is getting broken down before that kid gets to the 13. Yeah. How do we do that from a policy level, or what do we do there to try and invest in the future?
I mean, to sort of bring the conversations together. I mean, one of the recommendations we've made to government is, to look at like community strengthening, because where we see the really good work being done around family, domestic or sexual violence is in communities where people know each other. So, like for an Aboriginal community with an Aboriginal community controlled organisation, they know the community members, they know the history, they know what's going on locally. And there's this tendency where government wants to sort of fund like these standard programs that get kind of rolled out from on high, as opposed to, no, like you need to support this agency, this service at a local level, to be able to have those conversations locally, to get in early. You've got a young guy, you know his background, his girlfriend's just fallen pregnant. We know that first pregnancy is a big kind of risk period. How are you going to support him to be a good dad? And so it's also about saying to government, and we were in Canberra a couple of weeks ago saying this, and I'm in Canberra this week delivering the same message. how do you build communities up? And, not to be kind of facetious about it, but like if you think about Jungle Brothers in that way, like it's why I really enjoy coming here, is because it is a really intentional community. And, for those of us who are not going to church, or we're not doing, those community things that don't really exist anymore, like you do need institutions like this that function to kind of build out those networks. And so that kind of is part of my, that is actually part of the solution, is how does government invest back into communities so that we can build up those institutions. And what comes with those institutions is, if you think about JB, and something that I find really sweet around JB is like, as much as you guys will have the intentional like Friday night chats about mental health, but there's actually lots of check-in that goes on here, and lots of times where people will be like, actually, I've had a really tough week, and actually something really bad happened to me me and my partner last week, and we don't have to have an hour's therapy talk about it, but actually just touching base with someone and being like, man, I'm really, really sorry to hear that. And there's a lot of men where that never happens. They just never have that moment of like, and being able to walk away from that encounter and be like, yeah, it's actually okay for me to feel crap at the moment, and someone understands me. And if I wanted to have more of a conversation about that, I could. Yeah.
I'd like to drill in a little bit into like the nature, like the actual realities of domestic violence. And I guess I got a couple of questions I want to ask, because just to understand it better. And I think that, there's, it's easy to make assumptions about a lot of this stuff. The first one that I wanted to ask is, familiar with misogyny, right? How much does misogyny play a part in domestic violence actually, in your view?
So what we know is that men who hold really misogynist views are more likely to perpetrate. That's what we know. But the question is whether or not, in academic terms, whether that's predictive. So they commit domestic violence because they hold misogynist views, or they hold misogynist views because they commit domestic violence. Because a lot of the times our beliefs are post hoc, like we develop them to justify what we do, and we develop them to justify what we want to do. And so I think that's been sort of a failing of our response, is the assumption is, oh, well, firstly, we can change attitudes. And I think we've kind of learned that that's pretty hard to do. But even if we could change attitudes, would that reduce rates of violence? Now, to give you an example, young men hold much more gender egalitarian views than older men, but also younger men on average perpetrate more physical and sexual violence than older men.
Can you explain that? What's gender egalitarian views?
Just more positive views about women.
Right.
Yeah.
But they're more, they hold more view, like they on the whole hold more gender egalitarian views, but are more likely to perpetrate violence.
Yeah.
Right.
But young men perpetrate, basically the majority of offending is men under 30. Of all offending, of all types of offending, the majority of it, and most men will age out of all of their criminal offending over time. They don't even need an intervention. They just stop doing it as they get older. And so in a way that's not a surprise, but it kind of is a bit of evidence against this argument that all we need to do is teach more gender equality to boys, which is fine. Teach gender. I'm not against gender equality, but as a prevention strategy, it's not kind of hitting the mark. And so, in terms of how DV looks, there's basically a couple of kind of cohorts of domestic violence offender. You've got the disorganised, really chaotic offender where there's a lot of mental health, normally alcohol and drug. He's normally been raised in DV. He might have experienced child sexual abuse or other sorts of child maltreatment. So he's had a crappy life. He's been treated like crap. He treats other people like crap, basically. You've also got the more kind of middle class offender who presents, frankly, a bit more psychopathically. So he presents really well, the family looks really good externally, the kids are going to school, all of that stuff. And then at home, he's obsessively controlling and really dangerous, basically. Now, he's not the majority offender, but he's not a small proportion. He's probably 20 or 30%. And he's much more of a challenge for us because he's much more premeditated. about his behaviour, and that family's got less intersection with the welfare and the response system. Whereas like the more chaotic offender, like frankly, he's such a mess. We can see him.
Right.
And he's already got other intersections with the police. Yeah.
And so say to that, the second cohort there, the more kind of the hidden one, the middle class one. Where does, right, so that question about misogyny and it not necessarily being a marker of someone who's going to, because that person may very well not share any misogynistic views if asked. Where does that domestic violence come from? Because for context, I think it's easy to go like, well, that person hates women, so they're going to do bad things to women. But it's really tricky when it's like, no, that person seems to respect and love women the same as, like, it's so strange to me talking about gender in this way. But
he'll certainly know the verbiage of I respect women, all of those things. He'll certainly say it if he's asked. He is almost without question an out misogynist. The question is why. So there's a couple of things. So firstly, if you're sexist, if you're a misogynist, very rarely you're just a misogynist. You're normally racist. You're normally homophobic. You normally have a really black and white cognitive style, but one that suits you because it makes whatever you are, your identity, your position in the world, it makes you feel superior, basically. So their misogyny tends to be part of a pretty like narcissistic way of kind of organising their thinking. In terms of where his violence comes from, it's often around control, and that's where we get this coercive control. So he cannot trust anyone. He's intensely jealous. He is obsessively controlling what his partner does and says and so on. In terms of where that comes from, look, he's often got a child maltreatment background, but not always. And I frankly think some boys and men are just vulnerable to this kind of cognitive style. And I've got some theories as to why. There are some neurophysiological differences between the way that boys and girls' brains develop. And there is some evidence to suggest that you have certain boys who, through just kind of a twist of fate or whatever it might be, they spend time as young boys in a kind of a window of vulnerability where this anger and fear and lack of trust kind of gets laid down in their psychological architecture. Because, frankly, you get some of these offenders where they have no risk factors at all. They came from privileged backgrounds, perfectly good parenting, all of their siblings are fine, and they are just a psycho. And I don't think it's because they made bad choices or they're morally a bad person, although frankly they're pretty unlikable as adults. I suspect something's gone on in early childhood that we just haven't quite put our finger on yet.
And is that, you alluding to like something in their environment, their social group, or is it something more like an undercurrent within the family environment? Like, what's your thoughts there?
I think sometimes I think for some boys and men where there's just an underlying vulnerability, and some of this is I think neurological and physiological, because boys and men don't respond to this. We have different responses to adversity. We have different responses to family environments. And sometimes you can have a family where the parenting is fantastic and it works for 2 out of the 3 kids and they're fine. But it was the wrong environment or the wrong parenting style for that one kid. And you'll sometimes have somebody come out of a really good family environment. They're actually quite damaged. And nobody did anything wrong, but they needed something different and they didn't get it. Sometimes you've just got this underlying vulnerability. It's sort of nobody's fault, but it can cause quite a lot of damage.
So a further question off that, if I may.
Yeah.
So that implies, like, so thinking about that cohort, that implies like a chronic enactment of violence, right? Something that's playing out over time, coercive controls, etc., manipulation and whatnot. How much of domestic violence is sort of categorized as chronic, ongoing, versus incidental? And I say incidental as in, getting drunk and then
Yep.
guy beats up his wife
Yep.
and then it's like, oh, fuck, pulls his head in. And I don't know if that plays out that way, but...
No, it's a great question. And so certainly you've got intimate partner violence that takes the form that you described. So it's not done with the intention of control. These are messy people. This is a messy guy. It's a messy couple. There's alcohol. There's drugs. People are not emotionally regulated, and often there'll be mutual couple violence between the two of them, which is dangerous for the woman because the man is stronger. But it's basically a mess, for want of a better term. And that is different from a man whose violence is part of a campaign of control. And really the key question that really differentiates those two situations is to the woman, and it says, are you afraid to say no to your partner, right? So if your partner asks for something, whatever, are you afraid just to say no or to disagree with him? And that's a good way of, I think, differentiating between, is this a relationship where you've got this undercurrent of control and fear, or is this a more, as you say, sort of episodic example of violence where that couple is not treating each other very well, things are escalating, it's really unhealthy. And, depending on the situation, we might want to attribute blame to the male partner. He might be the primary protagonist. But from my point of view, from a prevention point of view, that is a really good scenario for us to get involved in because we can start to pull the heat out of that situation pretty quickly. And to be clear, that situation can escalate to homicide. It's not as though there's not murder that happens in that situation. It does.
I just want to ask if you could just go back and define domestic violence a bit. Maybe we should have started there. But I guess, and I heard, in this recent debate, you saying gendered violence,
Yep.
and that's what you work on currently. And I guess that's between, different genders. But then there's also just DV in general, because does domestic violence, cover, parents to child and all of that together.
Yep.
And then furthermore, I also want to know, what does it look like? Not to be grim about it, but in terms of the terminology and how someone's prosecuted, is it, there's that kind of manipulation, which can be domestic. Oh, well, I don't know if that's domestic violence or not. But then there's pushing, there's grabbing, there's and then there's obviously blows and hitting and stuff like that. Can you just define it a bit more?
Yeah, so in terms of sort of how we define it, so family violence as a term, just refers to any violence within the family. So it can include parent to child. It can include child to parent, which happens quite a bit. I think it's a useful term. I do a lot of work on child sexual abuse in the family. I see that as a form of family violence. So you've got sort of family violence, and that's also important in a First Nations perspective because it also captures the fact that sometimes you'll see perpetration in family systems, so outside of the nuclear family as well. Intimate partner violence for me is any act of physical or sexual violence between intimate partners or ex-partners. Domestic violence tends to be used to refer to a pattern of controlling, terrorising violence, basically. So intimate partner violence, from my point of view, is pretty neutral. It's any violence in an intimate relationship or a separated relationship. But domestic violence tends to be used to refer to that more controlling, dangerous violence. Separate to that, you've then got coercive control. So that is the attempt to basically control and enforce obedience within the relationship. That includes emotional abuse, financial abuse as well.
That's a shit one.
Yeah. And they all sort of intersect and overlap, but recognising, one of the reasons why there's been a push to criminalise coercive control is that we've got a category of homicide, intimate partner homicide, where there's that couple has had no intersections with police at all up until the point of murder, even though that guy's behaviour is very extreme, really, really extreme. He's intensely jealous, controlling and so on, but none of that behaviour is illegal. So one of the reasons why we've been pushing to criminalise coercive control, so if that was prosecuted, you would need to basically establish at least 3 incidents whereby the man has sought to control her conduct. And you can do that through like bank statements, through SMS, text messages, these sorts of things, is so that we can get in earlier before the escalation to homicide.
So you kind of got to educate women on that because you need evidence. So, you know, if they just go, he did it 3 times and he said this, like,
Yep.
It's getting the text messages and looking at the bank.
And the threshold for prosecution is high. You know, the threshold for prosecution is high. Like, this is not a trivial offence, and you need to be able to establish that the conduct was undertaken with the intention of sort of menacing and harassing someone. So I think it's sort of a good option to have in our arsenal. But the challenge with coercive control is it often looks, especially early on, it looks like romance. So, you know, the male partner says, you know, you can't go and see your male GP anymore because you're so attractive and you're so gorgeous that I can't imagine that any man would look at you without wanting to have sex with you, so you can't go see your male GP. And, you know, like, frankly, that can be really pretty intoxicating early
Flattering.
on. Right?
Yeah.
It can. I mean, the fact is like a healthy relationship is just kind of one where 2 people are mundane together, right? But where you've got a narcissist who's paying attention to you and is like, you're the most incredible person I've ever met. You're the most, I've never seen it. You know, you're like, that is a very unusual experience, basically, if it happens to you. Like, to be in that spotlight early on is incredible because that's not a normal way for human beings.
I had a girlfriend that didn't think I was interested enough in her because I wasn't jealous.
That's right.
About her hanging
That's
out
right.
with guys. I'm like, no, I'm just cool with it. You know,
Okay.
like, do you not love me?
But no, that's a really important part of this dynamic when we talk about education, because you know, as much as we talk about, you know, men's attitudes to women, you know, there's also like educational work to do with women, which is like, you know, when he's stalking and tracking you and wants to know where you are all the time, that's bad. You know, like, that's not good. And sometimes women have the expectation that they will have a jealous partner and they will, that there will be that sort of interaction. And there's also cultural differences there. But even when we look at things like so for dads who are having their first kid, and what we know is, like, for the relationship, for prevention of domestic violence, prevention of child abuse, it's really good for dads to be involved in early infant care. And that's really beneficial in a range of ways, including for dads that have had crappy childhoods. It's actually a really good way to kind of reparent, is to kind of learn how to be a good parent. It's really sort of healing. But, you know, sometimes mums, because the dad doesn't know how to hold the baby and he doesn't know how to do all those things that often women are better at early on. And so there can be that protectiveness around the infant, which is like, you're crap at this, you know.
Give it to me.
Yeah, give it to me. And then you start to see this segregation of labour where all of a sudden all of the work of looking after the baby becomes mum's job and dad's off doing his other stuff. And there can be resentment around that. But part of that is also getting in early to say to mum, oh, like, actually just give him 5 minutes and let him, like, you know, he'll figure it out and he wants to. And so, yeah, there's lots of, I think, more subtle things, some educational work to do, I think, on both sides. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel that a lot, you know, and I guess a lot of the stuff that we've spoken about, especially with the boys and stuff, I can't help it's hitting home because I have my 2 boys and my little girl, and and Joe too has his little boy, and we have these conversations from time to time in the office. I'm a little bit ahead, so I'm invested in good parenting. I really enjoy it. I had mixed background with my upbringing, but definitely a strong sense of family and definitely a strong sense of what's right. And anyway, I'm struggling with, you know, listening to what's going on and how the attitudes are changing, what's in the news, but and also just trying to do my own thing at home. And yeah, it's really tough because a lot of it is very subtle. And that's why I asked you about, like, you know, what can we do about it? Because I think, like, a lot of it is fathering, you know, besides the systems and stuff. And I'm just like, how do we help guys be better dads? And there's that thing and I've witnessed that a lot where you have the separation of labour and the guys will just lean out of it and the women will lean into it, and then you'll just have this separate thing. But to me, I'm like, how do we bring, like what you said, building the communities, how do we, if we have to in a modern world, reimagine the role of a father that's not just bringing money in?
Yep. Yeah.
'Cause you don't have to be the breadwinner to be a very important part of the family. How do we get couples like, you know, working together in that kind of health promotion way?
Yep.
Like, how does part of your budget promote? Yeah, how do we do that as a culture? I mean, it's
yeah.
difficult because also we're a melting pot of different cultures.
Yep.
So, and it's just weird. Like, I guess that's, I always think about like, fuck, what do we do there?
A Jungle Brothers in every suburb.
Basically, you know,
It's the local, like it is the local work.
we get
like,
government funding for that.
That's why you're here, Michael.
No, but it is the local work, like, and it has to be done locally, and it has to be done over time, you know, in different cultural groups, and like that's actually how we're going to make the long-term change. But yeah, I mean, I also, because I do work primarily in child maltreatment, and I don't have kids, and I often am speaking to parents where there's all this anxiety about like, how do you do this properly? And it's like, it's from my point of view, again, as someone that doesn't have children, I'm like, it's really simple. If you can just love your child and be interested in your child and be like genuinely curious and enjoy your child, you're probably going to be fine, because that's actually all that human beings really need, is someone that's interested in them. And I think for boys, you know, they can be shut down because we learn early on that sometimes the things we think or feel are dangerous, that there's going to be a social cost to the things that we think or feel, that we need to sort of cut some of these things off, or not share them. And I think that's where, you know, that build up over time. But that's partly self-protective. I mean, people don't realise the cost for a boy of getting that wrong and what that can mean at school. You know, what that can, and I will say as someone that got that wrong from the age of like 6 to 16.
Got what wrong?
Well, I mean, as outspoken as I am as an adult, I was fairly outspoken as a child. But also, like, I grew up in like quite a working class kind of family and part of town, and like, you know, this is the 80s and the 90s.
Sydney?
I'm gay. No, Melbourne.
Okay.
But like on like the northeastern, you know, my dad was in the army, my mum was a nurse. And so, like, I like growing up just could not. I don't know. I got beaten up every day for 10 years. Like, I really did, and it's why I'm quite a hard ass as an adult, because I've kind of been through it. And so people, you know, and I think this conversation like gender equality and like, you know, boys need to change their attitudes. And I think people don't realise when you're a boy or a man, the cost of getting that wrong, and the cost of like, if socially you say or do something that puts you on the outer of like the male peer group, like that can really be the end of you. It can be the end of your job. You know, you're going to have to leave. It can be the end of, for a teenage boy, you don't get to just move schools, you know, if you've said or done something where you're standing up against someone, and all of a sudden that puts you in the spotlight. You know, that's potentially quite a dangerous thing to do. So there's a lot of discussion about like stand up and speak out. And it's like, well, that's fine up to a point. But I will say, as someone that's been doing that for about 40 years, that can be a really lonely thing to do.
I mean, and surely built into built in through our evolution is like, don't get ostracized.
That's right.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So don't say some shit that's going to put you on the outer. Yeah. I joined a Facebook group recently. I haven't done that for about 10 years, but I'm trying to get into hunting. And so I've, and deer hunting. And so I've joined this like hunting group, and it's pretty cool. People are sharing their stories, and then every now and again something gets posted, and then, you know, you look at the comments and like someone will make just a really fucking poor comment. And I read one, a woman had posted something, a female hunter, which you don't see a lot of, and a guy had said, you know, commented on her, a couple of guys had, and a bunch of guys had liked it. And I was like, man, that's so disappointing. Like, I'm like, I don't know if I want to be part of this group anymore. Yeah. And back and forth. And then I read some of your work yesterday, and then I was like, I'm going to say something. Yeah. And so I jumped on and I said something to that guy, and I'm like, I'm probably going to have to leave the group as a result of this. And it made me question, like, fuck, but I want to be part of it. Oh, I hope everyone doesn't think I'm an idiot. Like, maybe he didn't mean it that way. Like, you start to question And it speaks exactly to that point of like, you want to speak out, but there's a lot riding on it.
Yeah.
And you know, that was a very low value thing for me because it's some Facebook group that I really don't give a shit about. But when it's your classmates who you're with every day, or your work colleagues who you're with every day, and you're trying to climb the ladder, that is kind of your whole world.
Yeah, no, that's right. And so it's not to say that you don't do it. You know, it's not to say that you don't take that step, but the truth is that it's a pretty high bar, and we just need to acknowledge that. You know, I've done work, you know, with unions where they're looking around gender equality, but they're dealing with like an all-male shop floor. And the fact is that if one of those guys stands up and, you know, calls out a joke or whatever it might be, potentially that's the end of his livelihood working in that factory if that goes wrong for him. So it's not you know, it's often presented as, oh, it's a little thing for men to do. And I think that's a bit naive about how men police each other, which is through ostracism. It's through violence as well. You know, less so as you get older, but certainly when you're younger. And, you know, I mean, I'm in the position, I'm in the career that I'm in because frankly, I just kept intervening until I was like, I might as well just do this professionally. Because once you're alive to the issues of physical and sexual violence, it's pretty easy to pick. And you see it a lot. And that's how I got the job that I did was, you know, I was 18, 19, a very good female friend of mine is a survivor of quite horrific child sexual abuse. And, you know, she was a housemate at the time and then a good friend, and just trying to get any like health involvement, police involvement, housing for her, anything was impossible. And this wasn't particularly the job that I wanted, but after 5 years of fighting that fight and having a very good sense that like no white knight was going to come in and make the situation better, and that if it, you know, I needed to, if I was really committed to do it, I needed to do it professionally. So I suppose that's what I mean about like the cost of being committed to the sort of work that often I think kind of proponents of gender equality think it's easy work for men and boys to do. It's not. It's work I'm really committed to, but it's also work where I do know what it ultimately the path it sort of takes you down. Yeah.
So, and I wanted to get to that, like how did you get into it? And you tell the little bit of like how it started, but like further to that, and you've had even more, you know, bigger walls to climb, and you've had to scream louder and louder at those times. It's really stressful. What actually is the driver though? Like, so where did you get that moral sense from, and where did you get that fire to keep on going, you know? And I guess I'm wondering, it has something to do with your experience growing up and the kind of trials that you went through, maybe with your sexuality as well as your parents and stuff like that. Yeah.
No, look, I think that's probably true, which is, I mean, you know, the first sort of 20 years of my life were not the easiest, but it also, how do I put it? It meant, firstly, I have a very ingrained sense where I don't really care what other people think. That's one of my superpowers. I really don't. And it's also because, like, in my formative years, people were wrong. You know, they were wrong, and they were wrong about me, basically. And, you know, and I lived in a relatively small town where lots of things were said about me, and everybody sort of knew me, and I just had to kind of live with that. And, you know, when I came across I moved out of home and this small country town as soon as I could, as you can imagine. And when I came across my friend, who we'll call Sarah, and she was just a housemate in a share house in Melbourne, and we got along. She was a really amazing person, but I think what struck me with her was the loneliness. You know, she'd grown up with really horrific abuse, and I think that was probably the thing I could relate to the most was how incredibly lonely she was. And so when we became friends, and she was, you know, very suicidal, and there was a police investigation into the offenders against her at the time, and I was really committed, to be honest, to not lose her. You know, for me, I was like, I can't I can't. I've only just found this person. I can't afford to lose her, And I think that was a real possibility in our early 20s, that if I didn't make a pretty serious commitment, and in fact we ended up moving from Melbourne to Sydney together. That's why I live in Sydney, was partly to sort of give her a fresh start. And so, yeah, and I think it was kind of right person, right place, right time. And I ended up just being quite good at it, to be honest. Like, I am quite good at my job. But it sort of took...
Seemed like it, yeah.
But it was sort of... That was an accidental discovery. And it was her suggestion. So she sort of was able to stabilise here in Sydney, and then she moved again to start her life again. And she's doing really well, which is great. And I was like, well, what am I supposed to do? And she did. She said to me, she was like, look, you're really good at this. You should go and do a PhD, and you should do this for a job. So, that was about 20 years ago. And that's how I ended up doing this, basically. Yeah.
You, there was a line, I wanted to write it down because it really, it hit me quite hard. It was in one of the papers that you wrote on, about masculinity and telling men to do better and how it's kind of not a great solution. And you were referencing campaigns around the globe or around the Western world that have been like, showing like tradesmen looking at the viewer saying like real men don't hit women and this kind of thing. And you were discussing how the implication there is that like real men are like working class men who work, working class jobs, and that, and it just suggested a whole bunch of things about masculinity. Yeah. And you were saying how, and I don't want to, I really hope I don't do a poor job of this, but the sentiment was that this thing that has given rise to this violence, we can't be use that thing to make them not do the violence, and that thing being like masculinity. Yeah. Can you talk on that?
So there was this really like seminal moment for me sort of in my life where like I was in my early 20s and I was really angry at what had been done to my friend. But also, I was really angry for my own purposes. Like I was really angry about the extent to which like my life had been upended by all of this, and also angry about how helpless I felt in that situation. And she said to me this thing which has stayed with me for a long time, where she's like, the last thing I need in my life is one more angry man. And I really had to like sit back and think about it in terms of like, you're right, like this sort of emotion, which is all really understandable and blah, 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 around my reaction to what had happened to her. But also there was kind of a selfishness to it. It was really about me, which is, again, fine, but it wasn't really about her, and it wasn't what she needed, It was actually scary for her to be around one more angry man. That was kind of the problem. That was the problem for her. That's what she'd grown up with, was these aggressive men. So, So when you look at sort of violence prevention, especially attempts to talk to men and boys about violence, it's often trying to be like, it's fine to still be aggressive and violent, but you need to do it in the right way, basically. And you don't get to have your cake and eat it, basically. Like, you don't get to say violence. It's good to be violent against men, just don't be violent against women. And I think that's basically the message of a lot of these campaigns. There's a crazy ad, you can still find it on YouTube. It's a domestic violence prevention ad starring Chopper Read.
I watched it. That's fucking wild.
It's just... Anyway, it's good for a laugh. I don't know. I have a black sense of humour, but
Explain it to me.
I'll put it in the show notes.
It's literally
Chopper's basically threatening you
to kill you,
saying if you beat up on women, we'll break your neck in here.
Yeah, I will kill you.
And then laughs menacingly at the camera in that Chopper way.
Yeah, and it only screened for like 2 or 3 like weeks in Australia before it was
they realised how wrong it was.
So, and I think also it underestimates men. We see this at Jungle Brothers, like we're working out, lifting weights, blah, blah, blah. But it's a really mixed crew. Like one of the things I like about Jungle Brothers, it's really like very diverse ages as well. It's not just like 20-year-old meatheads and working out together, it's 20-year-old meatheads with women in their 50s and 60s who are here. who are like incredibly fit, you know, beating everyone at all of the aerobic stuff. It's and actually just how easy it is for all of those different groups to mingle here. And I think sometimes there's this kind of sense that like men can't talk about our feelings, or we can only talk to each other, or all of this crap. And it's just not true. You put men in the right situation, and actually they're pretty relaxed and pretty capable of talking things through. So yeah, this kind of thing that we you know, the only person that can talk to men about domestic violence is a footballer and
a tough guy.
A tough guy. Yeah, no, it's just underestimates us, I think.
Yeah, cool.
It's not by accident, by the way, that we try to curate the gym that way, which can be challenging sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's something that we have kind of that we check in on, which is not only the diversity of gender but also age, and I think that's that can create there's bigger gaps going on, or I've seen in kind of recent years, where you do have, you know, people of economic status that hang out with each other at a certain age group. And it's like, I see that with a lot of people becoming parents that have not hung out with kids at all. Yeah. They don't know how to hang out with kids or young people, and then all of a sudden they kind of want to have one. But yeah, I'm really big on keeping that age diversity in the gym, because you learn it's such a different reaction to a young person than it is that when you have with a much older person. And I think, you know, part of a lot of problems with the world is that we don't mix enough.
Yep.
We're all kind of starting to huddle into our groups, and the algorithm's just kind of showing us the same people and stuff all the time. I think we could use way more of that.
Yeah. No, and you really sort of see it here, but but I think particularly for, you know, a lot of the issues that we do come across around kind of gender and violence, it is frankly all male groups, and men become like often quite shut down, quite defensive. You know, it easily becomes quite performative in all male groups, and that includes gyms. And then it becomes really hard for women to come in. It becomes really hard for, for other people to come in and be a part of that. So you really see the intentionality here, I think. Yeah.
Can I ask you something, which is just an honest feeling? And I wonder, this is something that I felt. I wonder, is this like what a lot of guys might feel? And am I wrong about this, or kind of how does this play into it? Which is, and I'm not following everything too very, very closely, and I guess in that I'm not following I'm not what do you call it? Like, I don't play out the performative stuff.
Yep.
You know, I try to be very honest. I'm not outspoken on any issue. I don't just jump on one bandwagon or the other. I think everything's nuanced and whatever, and I'm trying to understand it. But I'm definitely not one of those guys that's leading the charge. I do it in my own way, in my own family, in my immediate circles. But with the conversation about men, sometimes I feel like it makes me feel guilty of being a man a little bit, and I feel like there's some sort of discrimination going on where it's like, I feel like the language is like just all men, right? It's just men, and obviously we need to refer to it somehow. But sometimes I'm like, I'm actually a really fucking good guy. I know really good guys, and I'm concerned about this shit.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I feel like I'm a guy, and I'm not a small guy. And I've played, and I feel like when I walk down the street, sometimes people look at me as like an aggressive person, and I'm kind of like wondering how that's changing the perception of men as just one group of the population, and maybe there should be like better language around, or maybe, am I wrong? Should I just be like, it's not about you, bro, type of thing?
So, I mean, I think what you're describing is kind of an ethos of sort of collective guilt, right? So the idea is that men commit most of the violence, which we do, therefore men have this collective responsibility. The issue is, if you've got a guy down the street who murders his wife, there was nothing that you could have done. There was absolutely nothing you could have done. And so there is a real limit to that language around collective guilt and collective responsibility, because we know in our day-to-day lives that there's actually nothing that you can do in order to prevent those outcomes. And I think this is where the violence prevention message has gone wrong, because I think what we should be saying to men, and I think this is a violence prevention message, is be proud of your role as a dad and be proud of your role in your community, and that's your responsibility, right? Not this vague ethos where somehow you're burdened with what some guy in Victoria just did and that's sort of your fault somehow, and nothing that you do is ever enough. I cannot see how we're going to win with that as a message. Yeah,
because it feels like we're all guilty until proven innocent, and somehow I can reconcile that okay in my brain, but for a lot of guys I feel like it might just be pushing them further away to kind of be like, they're just going to be pushing back when they were maybe neutral. I'm not sure. But
yeah, and frankly, it's also about how we reach the guys that we need to reach, the men who are at risk of perpetrating violence, or the men around them. We need a message that works for them, and we do need a positive position here for men. And the idea that the one contribution you can make is not to be sexist and to call out sexism. I mean, that's fine, but it's actually not really much, it's as opposed to, build strong families, build strong communities.
That's what I'm talking about.
Be proud of that.
I think we need some sort of building of a vision of who to be.
Absolutely.
Instead of saying, just don't do this, don't do that. I think we need to and that's what I was kind of going on the values. I think that we've got to see what those values are and then start building that position up, reimagining the male role, and then it's in the positive kind of sense, and it's actually giving them something to aspire towards.
And if we look at some of the stats, so for example, as women begin to earn more than their male partner, if the male partner is sexist, then this actually increases the risk of violence, right? Because it's called the breadwinner syndrome. She's starting to earn more money than him, so it's sort of it's a threat to his masculinity. Now, we also know that doesn't happen when he is not sexist. We also know that if you work with the community, if you work with those men to be like, hey, aren't you proud? Aren't you proud of your wife? Look at what she's accomplishing. That's really incredible. That really reflects really well in your family. The risk of violence drops. So that idea of talking to men about building pride in their relationship and building pride in how they parent in a particular kind of way, I would much rather see us on the front foot around that positive prescription than a kind of a deficit model that says you're kind of sexist until proven guilty. And there's too many men who are getting that impression from the anti-violence work, whether that was the intention of the work or not, but that too many men are coming away with that impression. Yeah.
Dr. Salter, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, man. It's a real honor, and it's, we could go on for a long time. I have a bunch more questions for you, but I think that we've done a good job of getting into, sort of a small facet of your work today. And yeah, man, I really appreciate you making the time. We know you're a busy guy. Do you have anything that you want to push people towards, promote, mention at this end of the show? You're trying to get a social media following?
Look, you can, if you want to follow my random thoughts, you can follow me on Twitter /X. So it's Mike_Salter. That's where I follow my stream of consciousness. Yeah.
Anyone that's on Twitter /X is a man of internationality. Thank you, mate. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.